My name is Lorraine Ritchie. I am the director of the Nutrition Policy Institute at the University of California. And during a panel presentation in September, we received more questions than we had time to answer. So I'm following up with a few additional responses to questions received. One of the questions we got was, at what age is introducing juice recommended? It is recommended that 100% juice not be introduced to children until after they are 1 year of age. And then after 1 year of age, it is recommended that children have at most 1 serving per day. So that's approximately 4 fluid ounces or 120 milliliters. If the beverage being served, however, is not 100% juice, but a sugar-sweetened beverage that may have some lesser percentage of juice, it is recommended that the sugar-sweetened beverages not be introduced to children until they are much older, for example, after age 5. For more information, I provided a reference here for you to a report titled Healthy Beverage Consumption in Early Childhood. These 2019 recommendations represent a consensus from 4 U.S. health and nutrition organizations. Another question we received is, at what age is introducing solid foods recommended? Solids are recommended to be introduced at around 6 months and not before 4 months of age. This 4 to 6 month range in age is given because babies vary in when they are developmentally ready for additions besides breast milk or formula. Signs of developmental readiness include babies being able to open their mouth, reaching out for food when food is nearby, good head control, and being able to sit upright in an infant chair with minimal support, and being able to use their tongue to move food from the spoon into their mouth instead of pushing the food out with their tongue. I've highlighted on this page a report from a 2019 U.S. Department of Agriculture Feeding Infants recommendations, which includes excellent information on a host of topics, including the introduction of solids. Another question we got was, how long is it ideal for a breastfeeding for infants? Well, any breastfeeding is great, but longer is even better. Due to the health benefits that breastfeeding offers to children and women, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that infants be breastfed exclusively from birth until 6 months of age. And then once complementary foods are introduced, it is recommended that breastfeeding continue for the entire first year of life. Of course, breastfeeding can carry on even after a year, as long as it's mutually desired for both the child and the mom. And then finally, we got a question about how long is ideal for the full transition from infant to toddler nutrition. Well, typically children have transitioned to consuming the foods and beverages and the meals and snacks like the rest of the family by the time they're about 12 to 18 months of age. One caveat, however, is that young children up until about the age of 4 are susceptible to choking hazards. So some tip sheets that are available in both English and Spanish can be accessed from the U.S. Department of Agriculture on how to reduce the risk of choking in young children at mealtime. And I've included a link to those tip sheets for you here. So in closing, just want to thank you. Thanks for your attention during the Nestle Nutrition Institute meeting, and thank you for asking such great questions.
So the first question I was asked is, are there studies that have looked at actual receptor development by mode and duration of feeding? And in response to that question, I'm actually not aware of studies that have shown changes in receptor development as a function of mode and duration of feeding. However, I'd like to talk about some interesting evidence that breastfeeding can change the activity of genes that code for receptors. So there was a paper that was published in 2018 that reported that infants who were breastfed showed less stress reactivity as measured by cortisol in their saliva. And they found that this occurred as a result of methylation of an important regulatory region of the glucocorticoid receptor gene. Essentially, what this finding suggests is that through epigenetic changes, i.e. methylation of certain parts of the DNA, the activity of the glucocorticoid receptor gene is changed which in turn reduces the stress response of the breastfed infant. It's important to remember that these changes are probably not the result of the nutrition provided by breast milk, but rather they're probably a result of the bonding that occurs between the mother and the infant during breastfeeding. So certainly it'll be very interesting to find out more about this as more research is done in this exciting area of epigenetics. This question asks, when an infant gags to a new vegetable being introduced, should parents continue to expose it or should they eliminate it? And this is a great question and one that we have discussed at length over the years. Based on research that suggests that repeated exposure is important for helping infants to learn to like new foods, we think that that parents should continue to offer a new vegetable to infants, even if they're gagging in response to it initially. Although we're not suggesting that parents should force their infants to eat foods that they are refusing, what we have seen is that young infants between 6 to 9 months of age may gag to a new vegetable, but upon subsequent spoon offers, they readily accept the food. And so we believe as long as the infant is voluntarily accepting the vegetable, the parent can continue to feed it. It's important for parents to also remember that it may take 8 to 12 different feedings of a food in order for an infant to learn to like it. And so what they will find over time is that infants' facial expressions will become less negative as they learn to like the food better. This question asks why toddlers like chocolate milk rather than plain milk. As I discussed in my talk, children have an innate preference for sweet foods and beverages. And indeed, the liking for sweetness is probably the most dramatic example known of an innate liking for a relatively simple stimulus. The best evidence for this conclusion comes from human behavioral studies in which newborn infants have been exposed to just a drop of a sweet-tasting solution placed on their tongue. And what we observe is that they respond with positive responses, facial relaxation, sucking behavior in response to this taste. So even at birth, infants are showing a preference for sweet tastes. And it's likely that human infants have evolved this preference for sweet foods and beverages because they're a rich source of calories. And although in many societies around the world, including ours, we're surrounded by sweet tastes and calorie-rich foods and beverages, it's important to remember that this wasn't always the case. And early in our evolutionary history, the most energy-dense foods our early ancestors could find were probably sugar-rich fruits. And so in order to survive, it was important for them to find these foods and identify them and consume them. Preference for sweet taste is thought to have evolved to attract us to these two energy-producing sugars that are important for growth and development. And so in order to survive and thrive, it was important for young infants to recognize and readily accept these rich sources of energy. So although our environments have changed and we live in a world where we are surrounded by energy-rich foods, infants and toddlers and children and adults still carry with them the remnants of their evolutionary history. This question asks, does the presence of food in front of the eyes stimulate the taste buds? And so we know that exposure to food cues, such as the sight of food or the smell of food, enhances appetite and salivation. So essentially, it's preparing us to get ready to consume a palatable food. This is called a cephalic phase response, and this response serves to optimize digestion, absorption, and use of nutrients. This question asks how an infant can differentiate between sweet, umami, sour, salty, and bitter tastes. So, behavioral studies that have used a variety of techniques suggest that by the last trimester of prenatal development, taste buds are capable of detecting basic tastes and communicating this information to the central nervous system. So, essentially, what this means is by the time an infant is born, they are capable of differentiating basic tastes, and they are also capable of remembering, processing these basic tastes. So how does this happen? Well, essentially this occurs in much the same way as it does for adults. So we know that taste perception arises from stimulation of receptors throughout the oral cavity. The surface of the tongue is covered with bumps or papillae, which contain taste buds. And these taste buds are made up of taste receptor cells. The taste buds are able to distinguish between different tastes through interactions with various molecules that come from the foods that we eat. So when we eat a food, we chew it up, and the saliva in our mouth breaks it down, which makes these molecules available to our taste receptor cells. Sweet, savoriness, and bitter tastes are triggered by the binding of molecules to G protein coupled receptors on the cell membrane of taste buds. Saltiness and sourness are perceived differently. We know less about these basic tastes, but essentially we understand that this perception occurs when alkali metal or hydrogen ions enter taste buds respectively. So young infants are able to perceive basic tastes in much the same way that adults do. This question asks, what about using smell sensation to improve eating habits? This is a really interesting question, and when I first read it, I was a little stumped. I wasn't quite sure how to respond. And then I got thinking about a phenomenon called sensory-specific satiety. So essentially, with a sensory-specific satiety, it's sort of the idea that too much of a good thing may make you inclined to eat less. So sensory-specific satiety occurs when we experience a decline in pleasantness associated with a food that is eaten over time, relative to one that is not eaten. So to provide you with an example, let's say I gave you a plate full of pasta, and you might eat some of that pasta, but after a while you might get tired of it. And if I took that plate away and gave you another plate of something else that was palatable, it's not that you were full, it's just that you were tired of the pasta, so you would probably begin to eat the other food. And so thinking about this phenomenon, French researchers found that when an appetizer course and a dessert course at a single meal have the same aroma, people are actually inclined to eat less of the dessert. And that is because they've already become satiated on the aroma that was present in the appetizer, and so they're less likely to eat a dessert that has a similar aroma. So for example, if I was going to give you an appetizer that had a lemon aroma or flavor, and then later on in the meal I gave you a lemon tart, you might eat less of that because you became satiated on that lemon flavor earlier in the meal. And so that is one way that a smell sensation might improve our eating habits if we strategically use it to make people less willing to eat those high-calorie, unhealthy desserts. This question asks, what is the role of lactose and unsweetened milk on taste development? And when I was a postdoc in Julie Manella's lab, we conducted some research that showed that the taste profiles of milk can affect infants' preferences for basic tastes when they start eating solid foods. And so this research showed that infants who were fed partially hydrolyzed formulas, which have a strong bitter and sour taste, they're actually quite unpalatable. And if they're introduced after an infant is about 3 to 4 months of age, they can be very difficult for the infant to learn to like. They're also very high in glutamate, which has which has a savory taste. We found that when infants were fed these formulas, they were more accepting of infant cereals that had savory, bitter, and sour tastes added to them. And this was compared to infants who were fed breast milk or regular formula. So this research, as well as other research, suggests that we learn to like tastes and flavors that are associated with the early foods and beverages to which we are exposed.
Do you recommend iron from 4 months or 6 months?
I follow the recommendations of the American Academy of Pediatrics, which recommends iron beginning at 4 months of age in breastfed full-term infants. However, the World Health Organization generally doesn't recommend introduction of iron via solid foods till about 6 months of age. So individuals have to decide based on the risks of their population. Iron deficiency can occur early, but there have been some concerns about an increased risk of lower growth or an increased risk of infections in some populations with early supplementation. But overall, we generally recommend beginning at about 4 months of age.
Is it necessary to add iron in low birth weight babies? If so, when should you start?
Low birth weight infants definitely need iron because they're born without the liver iron stores that full-term infants would have gotten. There's controversy and uncertainty about when the net optimal time is to start. Many will add it at the time the child achieves full feeds if they're in the hospital. Some will wait till about 4 to 6 weeks of age. Others will wait until the baby is discharged from the hospital. In general, I recommend that sometime after the baby is on full feeds and tolerating them well to begin the iron supplementation. The usual dose is about 1 to 2 milligrams per kilo per day, except in very low birth weight infants, less than 1,500 grams, where 2 to 3 milligrams per day is more commonly used.
Is it necessary to give vitamin D in premature babies?
Premature babies definitely need vitamin D, as they do have active vitamin D dependent calcium absorption. It's generally thought that this calcium absorption does not occur right away, and therefore some people will delay beginning multivitamins for several weeks until the baby's several weeks of age, especially if they're in the neonatal ICU. Most will begin approximately 200 to 400 units per day, beginning when the infant is about 2 to 3 weeks of age, or if they're a very low birth weight infant, when they've reached about 1,500 grams body weight.
Is the type of iron more important than the amount of iron offered, especially in fortified foods or supplements?
Absolutely. There have been some cases in the past where very, very low bioavailable iron, especially elemental iron, has been used as a fortificant in national programs with little or no improvement in the iron status of the population. So it's necessary to use bioavailable forms of iron. Typically, ferrous sulfate is ideal, although in cases in which it can't be used, ferrous fumarate is often also used.